Thank you so much for watching our presentation on women in education policy. One question that many people ask is why educate women? And the goals of education in the United States are first, economic. We want to prepare workers and keep our economy strong. The second goal is civic, because we want to teach civic values and help democracy function. And finally, social. Education is the primary means of social mobility in the United States. When education resources were scarce, women were given only enough education to help them perform their duties in the household and raise their sons to understand democratic ideals and civic responsibility. When the cost of education increased, schools could not afford to recruit high school educated men to teach. It was easier and more affordable to train women through secondary schools and hire them to become teachers. Leaders of the women's movement challenged the idea that women did not have the same learning capabilities as men. And finally, after the Civil War, private colleges were established for women with the same curriculum as elite men's colleges. A few activists during this time. The first one was Mary Wollstonecraft, who advocated that coeducation would improve both sexes and society as a whole. Sophia Packard and Harriet Gills established a school for black females in the South, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony advocated that coeducation based on women and men having the same inalienable rights and same learning and reasoning capabilities. Today, women make up the majority of the population of college students, but are underrepresented in STEM majors. Colleges are making significant efforts to create mentoring programs in college communities that make women in the majors feel comfortable and welcome. After the 1960s, several different organizations bound together, and the beginning of equality among the sexes was born through Title IX legislation. So during the 1960s, education was not of the utmost importance due to other issues of the time period like segregation. The education section of the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1964 banned race but not sex discrimination. Title IX, a statute intended to end sex discrimination in education, became a law on June 23, 1972. Here's a timeline of the Title IX legislation. On June 23, 1972, the statute was passed. It reads, "No person in the United States shall be excluded from participation in activities." We need to fix that part. Click. On July 1st, 1974, an amendment is proposed to require the Department of Education, Health, and Welfare to issue a regulation that offers reasonable provisions given the nature of certain sports. On July 21st, 1975, regulations of non-discrimination in education programs become effective. Elementary schools are given 1 year to comply. Secondary schools are given 3 years. On August 30th, 2000, the Department of Justice issues a common rule to cover educational programs such as police academies and vocational programs for inmates. On October 25th, 2006, the U.S. Department of Education repeals the regulations prohibiting single-sex classes within coeducational schools and set in place new regulations that ease the. There are several exemptions to Title IX. The first is in regards to extracurricular activities, including Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and the YMCA. They were both able to maintain their sex-segregated memberships. Additionally, textbooks and educational materials that may be gender-biased are exempt due to the First Amendment rights. There are also several benefits. So first, under Title IX, physical education classes could no longer be segregated with the exception of contact sports and classes teaching human sexuality. The law also applies to educational programs that receive federal funding and to all aspects of the school's education system. Title IX benefits both boys and girls and is an example of 40 years of efforts to promote and establish gender equality in schools. It is particularly well known for its requirement that schools provide girls with equal athletic opportunities.
Let's go. 1, 2, 3. Let's go!
After being allowed to attend college, the next challenge to overcome for women was to receive an equal share of the resources allocated to high schools and college athletics. At the collegiate level, athletics is especially tricky. This video talks about Title IX's impact at Arizona State University.
Allowing boys and girls basically equal opportunities in the education field, and with that, I think you get the extracurricular activities in schools, which is, from our standpoint, it's the athletics.
There wasn't any resources, funding really allocated for women's sports prior to Title IX.
But you see, what was happening then is we didn't know any different. And when I did ask the administration why it was that way, the response would be, "Oh, honey, that's just the way it is for women." And my response would be, "I don't think it makes it right."
I never really thought about how much it really impacted everyone and just how much it gave everyone an opportunity to be here.
Seeing what's happened, I think Title IX basically is giving female athletes or females great opportunities in the education and athletic fields, and it's made a big impact, no question about it.
I truly believe the education you get as an athlete through your sport experience is probably almost as valuable as what you're getting in the classroom, because you just truly learn so much as an athlete, especially at the collegiate level.
If it weren't for Title IX, I probably wouldn't be playing women's basketball in high school, let alone in college. And it's just paved the way for female athletes to make a name for themselves and just really flourish in not only sports, but academics as well.
Well, our women's basketball program is having a Title IX celebration of 40 years with their opening basketball game, and they are going to honor 40 female athletes in the vicinity here that have had an impact with women's sports.
We knew we had a great home opener with Texas Tech because they're a perennial powerhouse, and we've got two really good teams going head-to-head for the home opener. And so with that, we thought, well, what can we do around that game, because we know there'll be a lot of interest, to do a little something extra. And we're excited. Should be an amazing event, and we're hoping that everybody comes out and sees it.
As former ASU women's golf coach mentioned, feminists argued in the 1970s that males received a disproportional amount of scholarships, coaching, and tutoring staff, as well as facilities from being student athletes, that female student athletes did not. The National Collegiate Athletic Association, or NCAA, saw the state of affairs differently. NCAA said that if more women were interested, then the sports would have equal funding. But since more women weren't interested, there was no reason to make there be equal funding. The Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Education resolved the seemingly chicken or egg question with 3 conditions, one of which schools must follow. First, the level of sports participation is proportionate to the numbers of women and men in the student body. This is known as the proportionality test. Second, if the school has a history of expanding opportunities for the underrepresented sex. Or third, if the school is fully effective and effectively accommodating the interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex, then they are in compliance with Title IX. Congress ordered in 1994 through the Athletics Disclosure Act that coeducational colleges and universities produce yearly reports on gender equality in their athletics programs. By 1995, there was the Cohen v. Brown University Federal Court ruling, which used the 3rd condition of the OCR ruling to rule that Brown University was not in compliance with Title IX, since cutting 2 women's teams left the interests and abilities of women athletes comparatively less accommodated than those of men. This opened the door for men's teams to sue universities for cutting their programs, and Congress recognized the intention of Title IX was not to make fewer opportunities for men. The congressional hearings led to a letter being issued to the OCR indicating the first condition, the proportionality clause, was all that was needed to be in compliance with Title IX. However, in 2002, the National Wrestling Coaches Association sued the Department of Education on the grounds that quotas discriminated against men because men were more interested in athletics. The Department of Education tried to take the middle ground by officially stating that the practice of cutting some sports teams to be in compliance was a disfavored practice and that an interest survey should be developed and implemented to determine who wanted to participate in sports, and then set the budgets accordingly. The Education Secretary sent out a clarification recommending that the survey be implemented instead of the proportionality clause in 2005. The NCAA strongly urged against implementing the interest survey, as did many other Title IX defenders such as the Women's Sports Foundation and National Women's Law Center. Most colleges did not implement the survey, and in April of 2010, President Obama's administration rescinded the clarification. This gives legal precedence back to the proportionality test, or that women and men's sports teams must be funded at the same proportion of women and men in the entire student body. Furthermore, on June 20th, 2012, President Obama introduced several Title IX reforms. First, the following United States government agencies will be working together to develop best practices. So the Department of Education will lead the initiative with the Department of Justice, Department of Energy, NASA, National Science Foundation, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Second, the Department of Education will revise Title IX's technical assistance to K-12 and post-secondary institutions to explicitly address STEM inequalities. And finally, there's a call to expand data collection and analysis to track relevant trends of the gender gaps across K-12 education. Before athletics began advocating for gender equality, feminists began supporting the idea of women's studies in public education as early as 1940s. Gender equality policies focus more on equal access and, for the most part, do not address the content of the education. Over time, this promotion of women's studies became an advocacy for sex education. The Women's Educational Equality Act of 1974 was spanned by this movement. This counterpart of Title IV legislation authorized funding to assist schools to develop non-sexist materials in textbooks, training programs, and guidance and counselors' activities. It also provided funding for teacher training and support research. It created the National Advisory Council on Women's Education Programs. Legislation was also passed for vocational training. The 1984 Carl D. Perkins Vocational Act required vocational programs to have a sex equality coordinator to reduce the sex bias in vocational training. The act required that set aside of a percentage of a state's federal funding for vocation training aimed at single parents and displaced homemakers. In 1994, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act revitalized the WEEA. The act encouraged teachers training to overcome gender bias and how the sexes were treated in the classroom. It promoted more females in math and sciences and encouraged programs on harassment and abuse. These programs have fallen out of favor. The NCAA was dismantled in 1988. WEAA is still a part of the Department of Education, but with a measly budget of $3 million annually. The ESEA has had little attention since 2000, even though the Perkins Act was strengthened in 1990 by increasing the set-aside to eliminate the sex stereotyping in vocational programs. It has since been weakened in the elimination in 1998 for the set-aside for displaced homemakers and removing the requirement for a coordinator. However, women's studies have still made an impact without being universally required. Single-sex schools were being challenged and were on a steady decline after Title IV legislation. The Supreme Court ruled schools could not be single-sex if another school was not available offering the same type and same quality of education. In 1996, a Supreme Court ruling took the benchmark for allowing same-sex education further. The ruling stated that a state must demonstrate an exceedingly persuasive justification for gender-based programs related to a government objective when same-sex education is allowed. The No Child Left Behind legislation reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that allows local educational agencies to use innovative programs, funds to support same-gender schools and classrooms consistent with applicable law. States such as Colorado, Florida, Michigan, South Carolina, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania have all taken advantage of this opportunity. Advocates for same-sex schools argue that the schools are not inferior and graduates to not have inferior jobs. Women benefit from not having to compete with men for sports teams, and funding and women get to maintain all leadership positions in the school. Advocates claim the schools free students from gender stereotypes. Opponents against same-sex schools claim that male colleges have a higher prestige. Women cannot develop the assertive skills necessary to be successful in the workforce without male competition. Advocates against the schools claim that gender-specific curriculum and materials reinforce gender stereotypes. 506 public schools in the United States offered single-sex education, and 390 of those schools are co-ed schools which offer single-sex classrooms. All states comply with Title IX legislation with different degrees. However, most direction resides with the state or local school boards. All states comply with Title IX legislation to different degrees. However, most direction resides with the state or local school boards. 3 types of state laws on sex equality exist. First, comprehensive laws that ban sex discrimination in all areas of public institutions. Second, human rights laws, public accommodation statutes, and equal rights amendments to the state constitutions that address sex discrimination, but without enforcement mechanisms. And 3, no statutes or constitutional provisions passed. Thank you all so much for watching our presentation. We hope you understand more about the history of gender equality in education.